what I've learned in my life is a victim asks why, and a hero asks what. And so when you're saying there's a setback in your life, I always say, okay, what is it that I can learn from this? Because there's no sense in dwelling on the pain.
Hi, and thanks for joining another episode of Stuttering Your Way to Success, because there is no success without setback. Today, my very special guest is Jonathan Lewis. Jonathan founded the ministry called Fathers for Fathers. Jonathan, why are fathers so important to you in these days?
Yeah, Eric. I mean, you and I were riffing for about 40 minutes before we got on here. And, uh, I was just thinking while you were introing us about like the greatest fatherhood story we know in all of human history. And it's that between God and Jesus. It says, in the beginning was the Word. And we know that the Word is Christ. And, they literally, the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost were there in the beginning and said, hey, let's create something beautiful. And then of course we know that Adam came into the scene and they said, okay, the second born of God, like God had two sons, right? If you think about it, for all the guys out there listening, are like, man, I don't know, like Eric, you and I have shared a lot about raising our kids and the struggles. You're not alone. God had one son who was perfect and is the Redeemer, that we all owe our salvation to, if you will. And then there's this other guy who's kind of like, yeah, no, it's that woman you gave me. It's all her fault that I ate that fruit and I'm walking around naked here. And so, the father son story and the father story goes all the way back to the beginning for those that subscribe to the Bible. And so, Fathers for Fathers for me really was born out of my own journey where I lost my dad in a tragic scuba diving accident when I was 15. I was with him in the water. I was not able to get him to the beach alive. I got him to the beach, but I lost my dad. And I had to very quickly wrestle with the reality of I am fatherless. And I was there at the moment it happened. And there's an element of guilt or regret or what if, or I should have. And so I had 15 years with this very successful, dad who was a developer and a business leader in our part of the world in Eastern Canada. And then I didn't have him. I was just fatherless. And I had to then find my way, groping, if you will, in my later teen years and into my 20s for what does masculinity look like? We know that the world tells us whoever has the most money, the most women, and the best cars wins, right? But really, it's a very shallow pool if that's really what defines you. And then we've got, going back to that early fatherhood story, we've got this word of God, this storyline for thousands of years that defines what a good man looks like, one that has character, long suffering, patience, perseverance, love, that's willing to sacrifice for others. Ephesians 5:26, it talks about husbands and wives, but my favorite passage right there is the very first part where Paul says, love your wives as I have loved the church. Well, Christ died for the church. And every guy says, "Oh, I'd take a bullet for my wife. Man, if we were in a dark alley, that guy wouldn't know what hit him."
Right.
But really, that proverbial bullet's never coming. But we have the opportunity every day to die to our flesh for our wives, to say, I'm going to serve her. I'm going to be everything that this word of God tells me I'm supposed to be. I'm going to fight for what is right. I'm going to stand up for justice. I'm gonna be humble. I think one of the things I've observed about men, because I've had to study men and masculinity in the absence of a dad. So it's like you overcame your stutter. I had to overcome a limp of not knowing what a good man looks like, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And what I discovered during that journey was what really makes a man powerful and attractive to the world, not just our wives, because we got to earn that one every day, uh, is knowing that you have the strength and power, but then seeing a guy who has the self restraint and the character to withhold that power and only use it for good when they see the need for it. And so I see a lot of guys, overpowering their wives, overpowering society. And society then is very quick to say, well, that's toxic masculinity. But there's godly masculinity, and godly masculinity is actually really strong, restrained, and deliberate. And so that's where Fathers for Fathers came from. You also know more of my backstory. Before I became a Christian, or right when I was becoming a Christian, my mother of my two daughters and I separated. I'll own all of it. I was a workaholic, and we'll just leave it at that. But I really settled into, okay, now my daughters, like me, are going to be in want for the continuity of a stable family unit, and I can't necessarily give that to them. So what is the next best thing I can do? Well, I got to show up as a dad. And so I've seen a lot of victimhood amongst men. I've seen a lot of villains. I don't see a lot of heroes. And so Fathers for Fathers is about encouraging men not to be victims. Don't blame it on external circumstances, broken family court systems, or my dad was abusive or an alcoholic, or my dad ran off and I didn't have a dad. Like, we need to own it ourselves, and then choose to be a hero. Choose to really define, what am I going to be as a man in the world, and how am I going to show up in my community, my church, my business, for my employees, and for my family.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So I've heard strength put this way. I've heard that strength is power under control. I
Mm.
thought that was a good way to look at it.
Yeah.
Um, what does a guy do who's maybe he's listening to this and like, wow, that sounds great, but I'm nowhere near there. Is to say, I'm
Yeah.
making mistakes. I haven't been the best dad. I haven't been the best wife. I mean, where do you get started when you're trying to rebuild and maybe your tools aren't in very good shape?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would like to think that, like Paul, I'm the model train wreck for for all the things that could have gone wrong. Um, and I really settled into, we just have to say, I'm here and I don't want to stay here. And I know what success looks like. I mean, this is just pragmatic, even in business, right? Every visionary in business says, "Hey, we're on this side of the lake, and does everybody agree we want to go to that island?" Right? Yeah, yeah. No, we should go to that island. There's lots of resources over there. There's safety because of the water that's between us and whatever's over here. There's no predators. Let's go to the island. So then the question is okay, well, how do we get to the island? Well, you could build a bridge, you could build a submarine, you could build a helicopter, you could swim, you could walk on water, but only one guy I know ever did that. And so we got to come up with a way to get there. I think for guys, we inherently want to take new ground. We want to conquer things. We want to build things. Like, it's in our DNA. And I think the trick is to say, I'm not going to settle here on this side of the highway or the lake and just be like, well, my dad was a bad dad. I went bankrupt. I'm in jail. I killed a guy. I cheated on my wife. I have substance abuse issues. I had a porn addiction issue. Like, you can focus on what's broken you and beat you down. Or, as the Apostle Paul said, you can take your thoughts captive and say, no, I'm going over there. And I don't care if I have to go alone or if other
Mhm.
guys want to come with me. But I think every man in his heart of hearts wants to be a trailblazer. And here's the thing, we're still just flawed men. And
Right,
so every trailblazer needs a guide the first time they embark out on a trail. And
right.
then once
That's
they
right.
know the trail, they're good to go. And
That's
so
right.
I think it's about guys like you and I saying, hey, I'm flawed. I've been divorced. I've made mistakes. Because, like, no offense to the, the John Pipers and the JD Greers and the Matt Chandlers of the world and the David Platts and the Dr. David Jeremiahs. But it's like people look at them and like, well, they're pastors and they got it all figured out. Or, the Warren Buffetts and the Bill Gates. It's like, man, these guys just have this charmed life where it's like they just think money and it just materializes. But I think really it's about saying, I want to be the best version of me that I can be. In my case, I say I want to be the best version of me that God's called me to be. And so I'm not going to compare myself to others. I'm just going to say, I want to blaze this trail. Erik Weir is my friend. There's things that I know I can learn from Erik. I'm going to humble myself and I'm going to observe his life. I'm going to ask him questions. I'm going to ask him to speak into my life. I'm not going to walk alone. I'm not going to live in the shadows. I'm not going to allow that voice in our head to tell us that we're not good enough. We'll never be good enough. I'm going to really say, no, I am created in the image of God and he has a plan and a purpose for my life if I'm willing to just have the guts and the stones to pursue it and obey him. Yeah.
Well, if you could go back and talk to your 20-year-old self, I mean, what advice would you give yourself?
Don't buy that motorcycle. That's you're gonna have a sore neck the rest of your life for that one and no money. Don't go home with that girl. That one you're gonna regret. And I know how good she looks, but trust me, stay here, stay at the party. But mostly, the most important thing I would say to my 20-year-old self is don't spend 19 years wandering in the wilderness along that beach trying to figure out how to get to that island. Set your sights on it, pursue God, submit to his authority over your life. And as Bob Dylan said in 1979, you got to serve somebody. It might be the devil, it might be the Lord, but you got to serve somebody. And so I wouldn't have spent 19 years scratching my head trying to figure out who I was going to serve. I would have been like, all right, God's given me these talents and I'm putting them to work for him. Yeah.
It's interesting you get the wisdom from Bob Dylan, but it's really all about clarity. I mean, what do you choose to do?
Yeah.
And when you're clear, it takes away a lot of the decisions you struggle with, really.
And resolve.
Resolve.
Yeah.
If you could think of, say you're hearing this, you're a new dad, or maybe you're a dad and you're re-engaging and you've had, troubled period of time with your kids, or are there 2 or 3 things or 4 things that you would say, hey, do this, don't do that, or these are some go-to principles? I mean, are there things like that?
Yeah, I can tell you the mistake that I keep making. I've got 2 teenage daughters now, and like only 13% of Canadian dads get shared custody of their kids. I was one of them, so I'm thankful to the Lord for that. But now I've got 2 teenage girls who think that, there was a time when every joke was awesome and dad was a legend. And let's just say that's not the case now, Erik.
Right.
Nothing about me is legendary right now.
Right.
And what I would say is focus on the positive. You can get pulled into dialogues about what happened and, how you could have been better or how you could have done that. But I really love in Psalm 51 when David, in the wake of his sin with Bathsheba, he writes in that psalm, he says, against you and you alone have I sinned. Mm-hmm. And I think the biggest thing that any dad can do is really go to a sovereign Savior who loves us and say, hey, I've really messed this up. If you will give me the wisdom and the discernment and the grace and the love and the compassion and the kindness to know how to field this curveball that my 16-year-old daughter is throwing at me, I would be in your debt. And so, like I texted my youngest today and Erik, she is definitely my daughter because she is full of, I don't know if it's appropriate to say this, but piss and vinegar. And she came at me full throttle Sunday night. And we went at it, right? And I'm like, no. And I'm like, and I realized that there was a point where I should have stopped and I kept going, and we all know we do it, right? It's the guy. Right. And really what I should have done was just been like, I love your tenacity. I love your spirit and I love your heart, and left it at that. Now, I did send her a text Monday morning, and I sent her another text today because I actually found myself smiling, thinking, you may as well have just been texting with yourself 30 years apart. Right. It was like texting with my 16-year-old self.
Right.
Angry at the world. In my case, my dad is drowned. Everything sucks. Nobody loves me, right? And my biggest advice would be just stay in there.
Mhm.
I think one of the best things we can do as men or as dads is not quit and show up.
Mhm.
And you and I have talked a lot over the past several months about that in our own personal lives, right?
Mhm. Right, right, right.
Yeah,
So let's say you listen to the show and you're a dad and you have a custody arrangement and it's not what you want. You're having
yeah, yeah, yeah,
3
yeah,
days every other week or something like that. You
yeah.
know, how do you manage that? And how do you find connection? And then you try to be pulled away from work items or
Yeah.
getting caught up on things. So how do you focus and connect, with children? And how important is that, in that amount of time?
Yeah, well, in the theme of your book, Who's Eating Your Pie, like what I loved about your book, and I read it in one night. You gave like such pragmatic, practical things in your book, from a personal SWOT analysis to like this is just the way you got to do it. You might not like it, but this is the way. And of course, I ate that up because you and I are a lot alike. But I did some pragmatic things. So here I was, out of a possible 14 days out of 28, I was getting my kids 11 or 12 days of the month. So I had to make some tough choices. One was, do I stay living in my ex's hometown where there's only 9,000 people and she's got a home field advantage when I'm from the big city with 500,000 people an hour up the highway? I chose to stay. That
Mhm.
was hard. I worked the next 14 years driving up the highway to work or flying to Toronto, which was a 2.5 hour flight. It'd be like living in, I don't know, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and working in Chicago. And I did
Mm,
that their whole lives. And yet I didn't regret it because it kept me anchored in where they were doing life. It was
mhm,
hard, right? Really hard.
mhm,
I put buffers around myself. In my calendar, I put all pink. So if you looked at my calendar, my executive assistant would see pink. Pink was my time with the girls. If it was pink at 2:30, it means I'm picking them up from school. My flight would come in at 1:45, and I'd be scooting down the highway to get to the school and be like, "Hey, how was your day?" And meanwhile, I was like freaking out on a tarmac because my flight was delayed. Um,
oh, wow.
I
Wow.
had allies, like find people that are going to cheer for you and support you, which actually included people from my ex's own family,
Mhm,
that want to honor that what you're trying to do, right? Instead of trying to undermine you, they're like, no, like this is not an easy thing that he's trying to accomplish for these two girls in my case. So pink was non-negotiable in my calendar. Get involved. I coached their baseball team. During COVID, I said, hey, I've got more time. I'll coach their high school softball team. We didn't get much of a softball season, but like be really deliberate about how you get engaged. Like right now, even on Fathers for Fathers, we're following the Kendrick brothers lead, and we're talking about what makes a good man a man. Well, being a teacher, being a provider, being a protector, and there's more. So I was very deliberate about teaching my kids. I thought, okay, you know, what do I value and what do I want my kids to know? Well, you can't do that from afar. That requires engagement. It's about being active. It's kind of like the theme of what we're just talking about, where I want to get to that island, but it's not going to be easy. It's going to take
right.
work. And so the biggest thing I would say is be very deliberate about what you want to do and how you're going to show up. Don't focus on how hard it is. Just do it. For me, my faith is a big part of who I am. You know that. And so I also cast my cares on the Lord. I'm like, Lord, I can't do this as a single dad with no family in a town that I'm not from. I remember actually praying, and I wanted to just move back to the big city and just do the every other weekend thing. And this isn't, if you're a guy who's doing the every other weekend thing, look, I get what you're up against. So it doesn't matter. You're just do the best you can with what you got, but be deliberate, make it count, make memories. My kids literally would roll their eyes and groan because I took lots of photos. And I would always say, we're making memories. We're making memories.
Mhm,
And nobody can rob you and your children of the memories that you make with them.
Awesome.
I had the privilege, and I hope I'm not speaking of school, but when you and I first met, it was only the second day, and I came back out to your place, and you're there with George, and we go out on the ATVs, and
Hmm.
I literally, as you know, took a ton of pictures and sent them to you because I was like, wow, like this dad is making memories.
Hmm.
I have this tremendous privilege of being here right now as we forge a friendship to witness this. And it wasn't lost on me what was so special about what was happening in front of me. And and so yeah, for the guys out there, whether it's something like this, divorce and trying to raise kids in the wake of a divorce or something else, um, it's about saying, I don't like the narrative, and I'm going to be deliberate about changing that narrative. In my case, I was deliberate about changing the narrative, but there was also an act of contrition and submission where I said, God, I can't do this without you, and I don't
Hmm.
want to do it without you. And what I would say is, He made me a better father and a better man. So I had the will, but it was like He also gave me the tools.
How do you find mentors? I mean, are there people, if you're listening to this and you're like, man, how would you find other people to like hop on your team or learn from? And are people willing to give help to somebody when they ask? If you're saying, because I think sometimes you feel isolated and like you're alone and no
Yeah.
one's ever gone through this before. If
Oh
you're
yeah.
having those thoughts, I mean, what kind of suggestions would you have?
Well, let's be honest. That's you and I once a week, right? I mean, that's every guy. I'm all alone. I can't do this. Nobody knows what I'm going through. Who do I talk to?
Right.
Our poor wives often become the brunt of that. But the whole concept of Fathers for Fathers is this very thing: don't walk alone, right? You hosted a group of guys, and that was the theme of that night. Men are not meant to walk alone, even though we're meant to carry a burden.
Mhm.
But we're not meant to carry the burden alone, and we are way stronger together. And it's literally the basic tenets of military regimental structure. Men are way more powerful as a fighting unit than any one guy on his own, right?
Right.
It's innate in our DNA. We hunted as a pack. If you actually believe there was a time when we were like cavemen, right? But we certainly are stronger together than we are apart. Great leadership teams are men working together. Frankly, great leadership teams are people working together, men and women. But in the context of what we're talking about, um, the great Dr. Tony Evans, said to me recently, you got to have a mentor, and if you don't have one, go find one. Um,
Right.
and
Right.
so for me, I'm very deliberate about finding mentorship, and I think I'm more tuned into it because the Bible says that God will be a father to the fatherless and a husband to the husbandless. And I think it's Psalm 59 or Psalm 69, but Psalm 59. But but when I was 16, 17 years old, I'm like, okay, I got no dad. And I got this, guy in the sky that says he'll be a father to me. And there was a bit of a prove it, like, okay, well, prove it. And but I became very hardwired to finding men that I respected characteristics about them and I wanted to emulate. Now, here was the funny thing: I ran as far from God as I could get for 19 years. But you know what's funny, Eric? When he says, I'll be a father to the fatherless, every single mentor that came into my life was a godly Christian man.
Yeah.
And I wasn't looking for that, right?
Right. Right. Right.
They were business leaders, church leaders, community leaders, but they all had servants' hearts, and they, for a season, adopted me like a spiritual son, much like the Apostle Paul did with Timothy. And so,
And and
um,
and and they knew where you were, and I've heard of this as
yeah,
like the hounds of heaven. It wasn't like they were judging you. They knew you
mm,
weren't where you wanted to be. How important is love? Because sometimes people think like they really connect by pointing out where you are stumbling or what you can do.
yeah,
Don't you find people sort of know where that is anyway? They don't really need that pointed out. How,
yeah.
how does going to some mentoring you who mentors with love or kindness, how does that change the script, so to speak?
That's good. So, I mean, really, there's two ways to influence a person. You know, um, a hammer, like the Marines, right? To beat them into submission, to do a trained skill that you want them to do. And that works to some extent, but you haven't actually changed the fabric or DNA of the person. You've just got them to conform, right?
Mhm.
We see a lot of that in the church.
Yeah.
But love is a different thing altogether. When you don't tell the person that they need to change, you just come alongside them and walk with them, which is kind of like a famous character in history that we all know about. And you model for them what a successful outcome looks like in every situation, and you draw them into wanting to emulate that. That's a powerful thing. And so, and it doesn't mean you don't point out their mistakes. Like I think about the woman caught in adultery. First of all, like where was the guy? Right? Like, do you ever think about? It's
Right.
funny. The Pharisees bring out this woman, but the guy is like nowhere to be found. Right? The other 50% of the perpetrating act.
Right. Right. Right.
But Jesus looks at her and says, "Where are your accusers?" And she's like, "Well, they've all left." After he said, "Let he who is without the first sin cast the first stone." And he says, "Well, no, neither do I accuse you. Go and sin no more." So he didn't placate that she had done something wrong. It was obvious, right?
Right.
She didn't need to be beat over the head with it. Or you look at the rich young ruler, the world you and I live in, right? He's so haughty and full of pride. He's like, "Oh no, I've done it all, man. Like I've lived a perfect life," right? It was like actually, like, do you know who you're
Right.
talking to? Um,
Right.
and like Jesus didn't look at him with contempt. It says he looked at him with love, and then he said, "You lack one thing." Right? So of course this guy's like, "Well, I'm perfect. So what's the one thing so I can be even more perfect?" And he says, "Go and sell everything you have and give it to the poor." Well, like obviously that didn't sit well with the guy because he went away heavy hearted. And then Jesus says, "For what's impossible with man is possible with God." Right? And really, what he was doing is he was challenging the condition of the guy's heart. And so to come back to love, I think that the way we mentor people is by challenging the condition of their heart with love and
Mhm.
getting them to solve the riddle. And here's what that requires: time. And
Mhm.
in my book, More Than Money, I talk about time. I know you're keenly aware of time. We get 168 hours a week. It doesn't matter if you're a valet at a restaurant, or if you're Eric Weir or Jonathan Lewis, or a pastor or a politician or a homeless guy, or like the leader of a nation. Every one of us gets 68 hours a week by God's grace to do something with. And I think that one of the greatest acts of love is when we give someone our time and slow down and come alongside them and model for them what characteristics we see that they need to sharpen and grow in. I think that's a tremendous loving act. It's what we call in Christian circles discipling someone. I have been the benefactor of that for the past um, 30 years, and it took 19 years for it to sink in.
Yeah, I
So
had somebody tell me in a real hard time was like, it's not religion, it's relationship. And he said that is key. It's relationship. And what's your relationship? And I think that was really helpful. But it's probably the same thing with we're talking with kids. It's not the routine, or you drive to school, or you pick them up, or you do dinner, or all that can be done. Wouldn't call it religion, but as you call it maybe routine, right?
yeah,
That's
yeah,
routine in our daily lives. And relationship is different. Like you were saying, it's the moments on the ATV, it's the moments walking, it's the
yeah,
the the moments talking, and so those create connectivity and relatability.
yeah,
Oftentimes, speaking personally, having had setbacks in various areas of life,
yeah,
um, those are teachable moments because I've heard it say that success whispers and a setback, really screams or gets your attention.
yeah.
What do you think, what do you think you can learn during a setback? And if you're experiencing a setback or experiencing separation or experiencing some
Mhm.
sort of pain in a relationship, who do you start with? How do you start to process that? And do you look at like what your contribution is first, or do you look at, I mean, where do you go?
Well, we're living in a very prideful and haughty world, right? And you just hit the nail on the head. I think we got to start with ourselves first. Um, yeah, like whenever I am faced with a setback now, I mean, you're talking about a guy who watched his dad drown, um, couch surfed and was borderline homeless for years, living in a tent in the Rocky Mountains, planting trees. I was literally like Richard Gere. I joined the Canadian Forces because I had nowhere to go and I needed to eat. And they promised me a square meal 3 times a day if I just marched and shot stuff. So I did. And what I've learned in my life is a victim asks why, and a hero asks what. And so when
Mhm.
you're saying there's a setback in your life, I always say, okay, what is it that I can learn from this? Because there's no sense in dwelling on the pain. Like there's a point where the shock of it is past. It's horrible. Someone's died. Someone's got cancer. You're sick. My wife had a car accident 3 weeks ago, as I shared with you. Um, the world loves to go into victim mode, and I think it's tragic because, as you said, these are the opportunities where like life is screaming at us, and we can really grow and learn from it. We can develop character, like James, Jesus's brother, literally says in James 1 verse 2, count it pure joy your trials and tribulations because they build character leads to perseverance. There is something to be gained from difficult situations. You look at Abraham Lincoln. I mean, the guy was a raging failure, the better part of his life, and yet, pulled a country back together against terrible odds, under extreme difficult situation. And love him or don't love him, um, his ability to draw people to him and navigate difficult situations was really remarkable. And he had counterparties, in the South that were equally as talented, right? And
Mhm.
so I have really, again, being a father's guy, I have been fascinated with men in particular, although there's some women that absolutely inspire me, that basically saw adversity in their life as, the greatest teacher and the greatest opportunity for them to grow as a person. I mean, you look at Corey Ten Boom. I don't know if you know her story or your listeners do, but her book, The Hiding Place, is about her and her family in Nazi occupied Netherlands, Belgium, and how they hid Jews and ultimately got caught. And their father died at the hands of the Nazis. Her sister died at the hand of the Nazi commander, where they were interned. And that woman endured tremendous difficulties. And yet, the rest of her life after that, she was probably the most powerful voice in Europe, preaching and teaching forgiveness and reconciliation, to the point where the very commandant who had supervision over her and her sister in that camp that her sister died at the hands of, came to her after she spoke one time and asked for her forgiveness and said
Mhm.
in tears that he was wrong and what
Mhm.
he did was wrong. And
Mhm.
Corey Ten Boom, because she had grown so much as a person, her character was so well developed from all the adversity in her life, she was able to take that man's hand and shake it and tell him that she forgave him.
Wow.
I think one of the most powerful things that human beings have at our disposal is the ability to take, brokenness, resentment, bitterness, hurt, catastrophe, and in the human spirit, turn it for good. Now, my belief system would tell me that that needs a nitro injection, and that comes from God and the Holy Spirit. But I believe that every one of us, in our heart of hearts, wants to overcome adversity, and live a life that, is victorious
Mhm.
over adversity.
Yeah, so
And
true, so true.
yeah,
So, and we were a part of a movie we helped to finance, and I think I was ended up being one of the executive producers on it, called Unbroken Path to Redemption, and Angelina Jolie uh, worked on the first one, and it was
yeah,
with Louis Zamperini. He was a
yeah.
POW,
I love that
and,
book.
and he
Yeah,
was tremendously beaten. Um, for many, many days, over years actually.
Yeah.
And he came back to a Billy Graham crusade and left. And came back the second time, fell to his knees, accepted Christ. And to this day, it was the most powerful scenes filming when the desk comes up
Yeah.
and you
Yeah.
just see it. That was a powerful scene in the movie.
Yeah.
And he goes back to Japan, and he sought out his captors,
Yeah.
and he never could find the Birdman. The Birdman refused to meet him, but
Yeah.
he went to so many of them, and they said, "I forgive you." And the people would just break down. And
Yeah.
over 300 churches were planted out of his efforts of forgiveness.
Yeah.
So it's so powerful. And and you just as we prepare to close, thank you so much for your time today. But
Yeah.
but as we prepare to close, what are a few things or anything you'd want to say to a father who's looking for help? I know you have a ministry, Fathers for Fathers. How
Yeah.
can they find you? How do we get in touch with you? And what
Yeah.
kind of what can you do to help somebody?
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, Fathers for Fathers is really something that came on my heart a year ago. I was heavy hearted about just the state of healthy masculinity in our world. And I was like, nobody even has a mentor anymore to tell them what good masculinity looks like. We're just being told masculinity at large is bad. Right. And I was like, okay, how do I wade into this? And I really settled on I'm going to be a flag bearer. There's a lot of good ministries. There's a lot of good organizations out there for men, whether you're dealing with addiction to pornography, or whether it's substance abuse, or you've got matrimonial issues, or in the wake of divorce, or parent alienation, or the list goes on. I mean, it's limitless, right? And but what I noticed, there was a lot of men. They recoil, they walk alone, they feel ashamed, they feel like they're the only ones, and two, they don't know where to go. And so Fathers for Fathers really was birthed for that reason, to be like a traffic cop. So I mean, it's crazy, but I think about two scenes from two movies that I love, and this is kind of telling. But The Patriot with Mel Gibson, the scene when
Right.
the French colonel says that their lines are faltering in that final battle scene, and what does Mel Gibson's character do? He picks up the American flag, and he rushes into the British lines to rally the troops, a flag bearer that others would follow, and it turned the tide of the battle. And I feel like that's where we are as men. Need flag bearers that are willing to wade into the battle unapologetically
Yeah.
and say, hey, this is what good, healthy masculinity looks like. Because we know what bad masculinity looks like. We got lots of it.
Right. Right.
And
Right.
two, and you're going to really laugh at me, and I'm going to date myself, but I grew up with a dad who loved, like all the old Westerns, the spaghetti Westerns and
Oh yeah.
thing. And
Clint Eastwood back in the day, the spaghetti westerns. Yeah.
yeah, like Josie Wales, right?
Been
But
there. Oh, don't
yeah,
go to Josie Wales. I've been there. Yeah.
yeah. And so in the
The
movie,
outlaw Josie Wales. That's what it was.
yeah,
Yeah.
in the movie Patton, George C. Scott
Yeah.
rolls up on this scene where Third Army is quagmired in the mud, and like it's just a mess. And what does he do? He gets up on an oil can and he starts directing the traffic and getting the tanks moving. And I think sometimes men know what they got to do, but they're just stuck. And it just takes a guy to say, hey, fire that sucker up and let's get this moving again. And I feel
Right.
like that's what
Right.
Fathers for Fathers is. So we have a 1-800 number that's live on our website. Guys are calling it now. We're recruiting guys to answer those phones. These are mentors. These are men who I guarantee you would go offline with you and mentor you. Um, um, we've got our Father's Day hike coming up. So June 15th, we're calling men into a place of contrition where they get real with themselves first, real with God about like this victim mindset that they're in. Fast. If this is your vice, give it up for a day. If golf is your vice, don't go golfing the day before Father's Day. Do it on Sunday. Um, and but fast, and then read Psalm 51 early at sunrise on the morning of Father's Day, June the 16th. Band together with other guys in your church and agree to walk a 5K at most to church, where you guys meditate. You don't walk alone, you walk together, you get to church early, and then go down into the sanctuary with the blessing of your pastor, have the church open, and have a time of prayer where you get on your knees before the Lord and say, I want to get this right. And don't wait to go to church on Sunday and have the preacher preach another sermon on Father's Day, but actually deliberately say, I'm gonna engage. I'm gonna step up and be the man that God has asked me to be. And so, yeah, you can find us at our website, and we're on Instagram, Facebook, you name it.
Okay, fantastic. Well, John, it's been fantastic having you on Studying Your Way to Success. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, brother. Bless you, buddy.